Hello and welcome to Seeing Jesus with Paul Miller. I'm Liz Boberl and I'm here with Paul and our colleague John Horry, who is back after some travels this summer. John, it's good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
So you have been overseas just doing a variety of things, mostly in Asia, broadly speaking. John, any reflections, any news or encouragement from what God's doing over there you'd want to share?
Yeah, I think with one broad stroke, going through 5 different countries, one of the things that really stood out was that realizing that God is calling so many individuals, let alone organizations, into very specific tasks and purposes. And just realizing he's gathering his resources, he's assembling, and it felt like he is obviously the master chess player, and he's thinking moves ahead, eternal moves ahead, that far ahead than we could ever imagine. And so there was this breathtaking sense that he is doing exactly what he wants to in a way that is far beyond whatever I could comprehend. Mm-hmm. And that the overall sense was that Aslan is on the prowl.
Mm-hmm. That's neat, John.
And John, in particular, you have noticed a real opening, particularly in countries where there's suffering, which is pretty much everywhere, to the whole our J curve idea, which is not our idea, but it's all through the New Testament.
Yeah, I in the U.S., generally speaking, one of the more popular pieces of our ministry is a praying life. But surprisingly, overseas, it's typically the J curve. And so it's because of what you mentioned, Paul, and I've semi-joked with you, that I think the Lord had you write the J curve material, not even for an American or Western audience. It was for one that was overseas who have embraced the understanding of the J curve because they are living it. And so it hasn't been just giving description to what they are experiencing as a believer united to Christ, but also with the great hope of the resurrection right here, right now.
And John, in particularly in Asian context that you've been in, what part of dying and rising with Jesus has helped them? And I know you've been in a variety of cultures, so this is a generalization, but still.
I think the J curve gives description to their current suffering with purpose. So you don't have to talk to them about suffering. They get that. But uniting it with Christ in the fellowship of his sufferings gives it even deeper purpose and a personal tethering to Christ. It's yep. Truly a fellowship with him.
Yeah.
And then I've heard over and over and over again, what's sometimes missing in an Asian context is a resurrection lens, not for the future, but right here, right now. And that God is at work bringing resurrection power, the power of his Holy Spirit, in ways that are sometimes missed because they're often embedded in the death.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Amen.
Sweet. Well, it's good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. So what are we talking about today?
Well, we are starting a whole new series. It's the 5th unit of our Person of Jesus study, which we will be releasing probably, 3 or 4 months.
What we're releasing is the revised version of it that ties in with the others of us, right?
That's right.
Paul,
right.
I mean, it's the same basic study that's been out
for 20 plus years. So it's called The Passion. And we are all of us familiar with Lent at some way or another, or the phrase, the Passion. And if anything, over the last 30 years, I think the church has been more interested in the Passion. And I never liked the Passion because it centers on the death of Christ. I mean, it's death and resurrection, but the Passion itself is this slow descent into Christ's death. And so we're actually moving into the last few months of Jesus' life, and the Passion begins kind of early in Jesus' life. And what we're going to do today is focus particularly on the humility of the Passion, because it's kind of what it is. It is a downward path. So it's sort of a close microscopic look at the dying part of the J curve. So, Liz, we're starting this first story. So we have several stories today from the Gospels, and this first one, let me just give some background on it. And disciples had failed to cast out the demon, a demon in this young man, when Jesus and 3 of the disciples had gone up to the Mount of Transfiguration. And so Peter, James, and John got selected out of the other disciples to go up the mount and into the glory. The 9 other guys stayed behind and failed on a job. And when Jesus comes down from the mountain, he is irritated that they were so faithless. So it's kind of like all of life begins with cell division, and there's this cell division going on within the disciples, like the human being, well, embryo starts out with one single cell that divides, and eventually hierarchies begin to get established within that, in that cell division, like the hierarchy of the brain, the brain being more important than, I don't know, the stomach, or I don't know. But so this is a kind of a cell division going on among the disciples, where, and naturally, as organizations grow, people with leadership gifts begin to emerge, and then you get this cell division going on, and so some people are promoted, i.e., Peter, James, and John, and there's the 9 that don't make it. So that's a kind of a formula for a not happy group of people. So Liz, do you want to read to us kind of what happens next from Mark chapter 9? And we are getting towards the end of Jesus' life now.
Yep. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12. And he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me."
Yeah. And it's just a delightful little story. That, do you guys want to say what's the fun thing?
I love that they didn't answer the question, because they knew their conversation was like, not one to report to the boss,
It takes me back to being in the minivan driving my little kids around, and you can clearly hear their argument. And then you ask them, "What are you guys arguing about?" And they just grow silent. Nothing.
Because, or nothing, right?
Yes.
We just spent 10 minutes arguing about nothing.
Yes,
nothing at all.
Yeah, it's such a human scene. It's why one of the many reasons the Gospels are so, they really capture the scene, and then it's what Jesus does there is there's this moment of silence, where he doesn't say anything and respond to them, but does like the way he pauses there, because he does 2 things. He has a child stand among them, and then there's the second. Then he puts the child on his lap, so you can actually see a bit of a pause there, and we don't know how long it is, but he's taking the time to letting them actually look at the child for a second, and then teaches them again this radical lesson, that they need to become like little children. It's just great. So it's just, they are, the disciples, the longer they're together, the worse they get.
Or the more honest they get. It's all coming out more and more.
Their actual nature maybe hasn't changed here, right? It's just there's less buffer of kind of polite getting to know you-ness.
I like that you use the word radical, because as Bible readers, sometimes we get so used to the concept of being like a child in what Jesus has taught and what he's demonstrated. It's like, this is radical for them to hear, let alone for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it because little children were in that day and age were, pretty low on the hierarchy, and Jesus is taking them an example of the little child, not the childishness of the child, but there is a natural humility and simplicity of children if you remove their flesh. So if you're a parent with toddlers now and having trouble connecting with this pastor, there are things about him that are just delightful. And this is just sort of an aside, but we probably know archaeologists, actually Jesuit archaeologists we probably have a 98% lock on this house that we're talking about, that where Jesus goes to Capernaum. Mark particularly refers to the house, and it's Peter's house with his mother-in-law, and they've uncovered it. You can go online and actually see the layout of the rooms. I don't know. It's just fascinating to see. And there's one room in there that the early church, that when they dug underneath it, it was a Byzantine church, the ruins of it. When they dug underneath that, they found a early Jewish Christian synagogue, informal, gathering room, just from the symbols on the wall. And then underneath that just remains, it was clearly, a fisherman's house. And there's no other competitor within the city of Capernaum. So it looks like they have found the house. And it's not a really big room, maybe 20 by 20. There's this one room that is expanded a little bit. And it's probably the room where they lowered the man through the ceiling. I just love how concrete the Gospels are. So just to give you the overall pattern here, as Jesus in the Passion, as Jesus is going lower, as Jesus is going lower, the disciples are trying to go higher. So, and it is like, it's helpful to actually see this in families and communities and churches. Things don't necessarily get better all the time with time. Sometimes as communities grow, jealousy begins to set in. I mean, what you're actually looking at here is the sin of jealousy, fleshed out. And Jesus responds to the sin of jealousy with humility. And it is what he is doing in the Passion. It is lowering himself down. And notice in this story, he talks to all 12 of them. So, and it's conjecture on my part, but I think it's an educated guess that the fight on the road south from the Mount of Transfiguration is a function of the division that happened at the Mount of Transfiguration. It would be a natural thing to do. That anytime someone gets promoted and you don't, is a natural place for jealousy to grow.
Well, and you couple that with, like you said, they failed to cast out this demon. So
right. Not only they get chosen, but they're failures.
It's not a great, that car trip's just not going to be great.
Yeah. But it wasn't like just the 9 were bad, because There might have been some strutting, because he speaks to all 12. You know what I mean? This is like, it was, so it's the sins of both, likely in this inference, but likely the sins of the powerful, the strong, and the sins of the weak.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, Jesus is speaking to both. It's just like you can never not be vigilant and praying against the dangers of jealousy and the need for humility within your family, within your church. You see these churches go through a wonderful time, and then these seeds of jealousy begin to grow. And jealousy is a kind of a quiet, unsung master sin. I'm not saying it is the master sin. There's different, Luther called pride the master sin. But I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on jealousy. And yet, certainly the 10th commandment, envy, is pretty close to jealousy, about coveting, and it is what is about, it's so hidden, the sin. And it for the people who have it, like if you commit adultery, well, our heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, but generally you've committed adultery. Or if you murder someone, heaven forbid, you generally know that. You might lie about it and suppress it, but you're not having trouble identifying what you did wrong. It is a sin, though, that it masks itself to the person who does it, because jealousy always shows, it speaks about what the other person is doing wrong. So it is a powerful, it's deceptive character. It is like cancer within. And I have seen churches, families torn apart by this sin. It's a very powerful sin. And the antidote for it is dying with Jesus. Like the antidote is to lose. If you end up getting caught in an organization like that, or a family, is that downward path of Philippians 2, is dying to self. It's really the mind of Christ, what Paul talks about in Philippians 2. Let this mind be in, because there's a problem of conflict in Philippi. So he begins chapter 2 with this great call for unity. And he says the key to the call to unity is having the mind of Christ. And they say, okay, what does that look like? And then he describes the downward path of Jesus. And I have been in situations like that. What it does, it kills jealousy in your own life, and it kills jealousy in the organization or the family. The only downside of it is you lose. But
it's a pretty big downside, Paul.
Yeah.
I like to win generally, but yeah. Okay.
But it makes room for the Spirit to do his resurrection.
There's actually discussion about that, about jealousy in our seeJesus community covenant that we go through every quarter. It's like a part of our culture. It reminds us what we're aspiring to be. And I know in there, you talk about jealousy grows in the dark, right? And so your moves are certainly to go down, but it's also to bring questions up, right? I want to say that connected to the dying, because you have to be willing to die, but sometimes you also have to be willing to just bring it up. Sometimes there's things that are...
No, it's really important to, I kind of skipped that step. Like you need to be honest, but
yes. What
happens when the powers that be, what happens when you don't get it,
yeah.
What happens if you've lost your voice in a family, an organization, and it is that's when you take the Philippians to, and there's a downward path in even being honest with it, because you risk, shame and disapproval. So let's go on to another example of jealousy. And this is a great one. This is as charming as the last one. So Liz, you want to read to us from Matthew 20?
Sure. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" And they said to him, "We are able." He said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the two brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many."
Oh, thank you, Liz. So, I mean, what makes this scene so charming?
That mom. I love that mom.
amongst an Asian community, they have the term the tiger mom.
Right.
Yeah. And so this is a Jewish tiger mom who's watching out for the good of her boys.
Yeah, the good of her boys. So it's just absolutely charming, doing an end run around.
Well, they're there. That's what I mean. Even as I read, it's like, they answer the question, right? So it's not, well, and she's with her sons, right? So the whole sense of like, mom is the one leading this request operation.
Right.
The boys are right there too.
Yeah. It's just charming. It's so, flagrant, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
And what, again, it's very similar to the incident in Mark 9, which Matthew actually mentioned in Mark 18, of the disciples quarreling, on the road south to Capernaum. And because Jesus in this incident speaks to all the disciples. In other words, he just doesn't speak to James and John who are trying to move up the ladder. He speaks to the other 10 who are mad at them for, trying to cut them out. It's kind of like, if you can be that, like, it's kind of like they want to buy stock at the Amazon release, they want to get in early, get the word in.
Yes.
It's just, so they're all mad at them. You know what I mean? So these situations like this is so careful. There are things people do that are wrong, i.e. it was wrong for James and John's mother to do this. And of course, James and John are evidently thrilled because I think Luke has James and John actually doing the request. So they might have done a follow-up, or maybe Luke was just kind of summarizing the whole event. We don't know. The Gospels aren't real fussy about the way we are thinking about things like that.
You were saying earlier, time doesn't always make things don't always just get better over time. The church can go through a great season and then there can be a hard season or something like this. I'm thinking too, like there's a kind of this kind of behavior from the disciples makes me feel like there's a little bit of an antsiness, like something's got to happen here. Something's gonna, like, Jesus's fame has been spreading, and now we've spent all this time together, so we're sort of sorting ourselves out, who's on top, all that. But there's like an antsiness to the story.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. Yeah. And you pick that up in the Gospels. The disciples, like, the threats to kill Jesus are going up. They're aware of them. They're not stupid. Jesus now, during this passion, is actually hiding himself now. I mean, there's some selective hiding he does, but throughout the Gospels, but now Jesus is in full hide mode. He has an escape village he goes to later on outside of Jerusalem. So he's about a month down in Jerusalem prior to the Passion Week. And he's got a village that he's going to at night. And it's why they have trouble getting at him. So tension is rising.
Yep.
So it's, they are on edge, the culture's on edge. And so it's kind of like people, like, something's going to pop here, and what everybody tries to do in things like this is to try to get out ahead of the pop and get it analyzed. And I think it's wonderfully relaxing just to go with the flow. I just think it is wonderfully And I'm not saying not being yourself or something like that, or not speaking honestly, but it's just like Jesus is doing that. He's being careful, but he's not trying, he's allowing this, and he's actually kind of creating, as we'll see later on as we go, some of the problems. He's actually but anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. John, would you read that quote from Henri Nouwen? Do you have that in front of you? It's just so good.
Yeah. Nouwen says, what makes the temptation to power so seemingly irresistible? Maybe it is that power offers an easy substitute for the hard task of love. It seems easier to be God than to love God, easier to control people than to love people, easier to own life than to love life.
Yeah, it's just so profound. And Jesus' response is he's got several things that he says to them. So he points, it's one of the clearest times of the Gospels, he points to his own self-sacrifice. What comes out in Mark that Matthew does not bring out is a couple themes that are very central to the book of Mark, because in the book of Mark, it's very clear that Peter, as the kind of the ghost, the hidden, Mark is writing Peter's sermons out, and the book of Mark is a descent into Jesus' death. And what it does is it equates discipleship with Jesus as dying with him. So Jesus has all these allusions to what we all call in here the J curve, and let me just go through them. The first things he asked James and John, are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? In other words, are you able to go into death? In other words, they're seeking instant resurrection. They want to shortcut the J curve. We call it in seeJesus, we call it skipping the dip. John, was that
I think so. That's you, John, right?
Yeah, which I thought was great, which is just sort of a draw line, from the top of the lower J up to the top,
In board games, they usually have things like that.
Yeah. Anybody who's little kids have played Chutes and Ladders or Sorry is a
Candyland has little
Candyland. How many times have I sunk in Candyland over the years? So he asked them, are you willing to go through the death that I'm going to? In other words, they want to skip the dip. And Jesus says, no, so quoting, go back to the J curve, Philippians 3, is no, you have to enter into a fellowship of suffering. And again, baptism, especially in first century baptism, was, even though I'm a Presbyterian, it really was immersion. You're going down in the water as a kind of a death and up through resurrection. And then they, of course, glibly says, yeah, we're able, we're all in here, kind of like a gung-ho guy here. And then the cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. In other words, the death that I go through, you're going to go through. And to sit at my right hand and my left is not mine to grant, but for those who have been prepared. Mark picks up that theme then later on in the book of Mark and has the thieves on Jesus' right and left. So that's where the disciples are going to end up, on the right and the left of Jesus. And then Jesus kind of goes global at the end there of Mark 10:42. He says, that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all, for even the Son of Man came not to serve, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus, what you're looking at there is what Paul calls the mind of Christ. So he's giving them the mind, like it's a whole way of approaching power and relationships, but it shall not be so among you. that you must be a servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. And then he refers to his own two sides to his death. One of the example of his death and also the atonement offering that the Son of Man came not to serve, but to serve. That's the example of his death, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And that's the atonement. So it's just a beautiful wrapping up. It's one of the clearest statements in the Gospels of the atonement of Christ. And Jesus links it to our having a life that is atonement-like. And again, our deaths for one another don't purge our relationship with God. There's all kind of big fancy words for that, but we'll just keep it simple. So it's just he wraps it up in the whole mind of Christ. He's giving them a different way to operate in life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Paul, I think when at the beginning of this episode, the word that rubbed against my flesh is when you said the passion is we're going to look at a slow descent, like this slow movement of descending down. So everyone's expecting and wanting Jesus to move up the ladder to make the power move, or the move to grab power. And he's doing the opposite. He's teaching the opposite. He's demonstrating the opposite. And so I almost picture, if you're like graphing this, it's like Jesus's line would be going down trajectory, and the disciples, their hearts and their desires are moving up. Yeah. And so there's a point where they crisscross.
And they're crisscrossing.
Yeah, they're crisscrossing right now, and there's a rub, and so that rub is just working against our own minds and hearts, our own ways of thinking and being, and the mind of Christ is now like grating against that in a very gentle but obviously honest and truthful way. So, I mean, this is, we started at the beginning even just talking about overseas Christians really grasping and taking to the J curve very quickly. I think it's not that it's not a struggle over there, but there's a little less rub of friction, because over there, you're in certain places, you're not a Christian unless you're really in it, like fully.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in other places, even like here in the West, at times, there is a far greater rub of getting to that place of even seeing, let alone receiving the cup in the way that Jesus is offering it.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Well, yeah, I think that's as far as we can get for today. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us. We'll be back on we were laughing. This is like one lesson on the humility of Jesus. And I mean, I don't know, this is going to take us a while to work through all these stories. And perhaps that gives us greater hope to work some of this humility into our souls as we do so. So thanks for listening. We'll be back again in 2 weeks.